In this brief tutorial, I will be talking about the major components of the introduction, which includes obviously the thesis itself, which is the centerpiece of the introduction. Just as a reminder before we move on to the first slide in this short tutorial, for you to look at the readings that are associated with this week, particularly the chapter by Cullen, which will provide you with additional material and information and hints about what makes an introduction good. And again, make sure you do that before you start writing the introduction and thesis. One of the first things I want to say before getting into the three specific components of an introduction is a common misconception regarding introductions, and that is the idea that an introduction must be one single paragraph. If you look at the example from a scholarly peer-reviewed article that is attached to the instructions for this assignment, you will see that an introduction is actually several paragraphs. It is not just a single paragraph. So I wanted to get that out of the way so you make sure you don't just have this sense that I have to put all this material in a single paragraph. So with that basic comment pushed to the side now, I want to talk a little bit about each component of an introduction. So the first component, the first thing you're going to do when writing this introduction is try to hook the reader's attention. Now, basically what I mean by this is, as you can see, the purpose is to draw the reader's attention. Now, you can do this in myriad different ways. You can provide an interesting statistic. You can provide a quote from the person that you're investigating and exploring in your paper. Or you can provide an anecdote, a story about that particular person, organization, or country. And what I want to do here is I want to point you to the right side of the screen as an example of this hook. This is one of my own papers from a recent conference presentation. And what you can see on this example that I used to the right is I basically provide a quote from a Washington Post reporter from July of 1983. And this reporter, as you can see, is basically talking about how the Reagan administration here in the 1980s is on, in his words, a collision course with the mainstream of Christianity in the United States. This is a very provocative quote, a provocative heading. And then essentially what you can see is by the end of that quote, and by the end of this discussion of what this newspaper reporter is saying, the quote that he gets from the Reagan administration official, I then introduce my topic. As you can see here, the last sentence, religious opposition to Reagan's intervention in Central America took many forms, but in terms of sheer size, no other effort topped that of the Pledge of Resistance. So now, right after that hook, to get the reader interested in what I'm going to eventually be talking about, I introduce the topic of this paper. In this case, I'm talking about a group known as the Pledge of Resistance. So that is what you're going to be doing here in this first part of this introduction, providing that hook. So the reader, I mean, there's so many things obviously to read out there. You want to grab the reader's attention, and this hook is a way to do that. You don't want to be boring. You don't want to be blasé. You want to be, again, exciting, and that's the whole purpose of this hook. The next part of your introduction, component number 2, will be some basic background information. Pretend that your reader has no idea what you're talking about. You don't need to get into dramatic specifics here and provide a ton of details, but rather just some general information about an event, a person, country, whatever it is you're discussing in your paper. That is the information that you're going to be including here, some basic background information. And then in addition to that, once you're done providing that basic background, you need to talk about the significance of your topic. So what? That's the question I always think about as I'm writing an introduction. Why should anybody care that you're talking about this person, this event, or this country? That's the next part of this component to the background information. And again, to point to my own work as an example here on the right, as you can see, what I do now in this portion of the introduction is I begin to talk about the Pledge of Resistance, POR. And as you can see, I write in August 1984, the POR published its contingency plan in Sojourners magazine, a progressive evangelical periodical under the direction of Jim Wallace, who also played a key role in the development of both the POR and the plan itself. So with that one sentence alone, basically what I do is I talk about the creation of the Pledge of Resistance, which actually happens concurrently with the publication of this contingency plan in sojourners, and also at the same time introduce a character, if you will, a historical figure, Jim Wallace, who is involved with this organization, because I'll be talking about him later in the paper. So that's the kind of who. What about the what? What did the Pledge of Resistance do? Well, as you can see here, I talk about how the pledge aimed, quote, to prevent a direct U.S. invasion of Nicaragua or to make such military action so politically costly it will have to be halted. Wallace warned that the POR would amass a large contingent of Americans to carry out, quote, direct action on the largest scale possible to bring visibility to any U.S. invasion of Nicaragua and demand that Congress withdraw U.S. troops. Now, another important piece that I want to highlight here and that I want to make sure that you understand in writing your introduction. So first of all, if you notice throughout these first two parts of the introduction, never do I say the very boring and prosaic words, or phrase I should say, this essay will be about. Don't use that kind of language. That is, again, too basic, too general. Never say the phrase, this essay will be about. Rather, again, introduce the topic with a hook, then provide some background like I've done here. And another point that I want to bring up here is, as you can see, is I'm using quotes from different sources, whether it be from a primary source or whether it be from a secondary source. And I want to reiterate the importance, as you're doing this, to cite your information using footnotes. And not only using footnotes, but also writing the footnotes in the correct format. Again, this material is available under the course materials section on Canvas. But nonetheless, we are seeing here as we're moving from component 1, the hook, to component 2, the background information, we're slowly building up to what you're going to do with this material. What is your unique contribution to discussing the Pledge of Resistance in the 1980s? And that will be the next portion, the final component of the introduction. That, of course, is the most important, the thesis. We've talked about the thesis a lot in this course already, because one of the things that you need to do as you're reading secondary sources is to find the thesis. One of the biggest misconceptions about history is that historians simply write about what happened and that's it. Well, as we've talked about throughout this semester, that is not what historians do. Historians are in conversations with one another, and the language and the main approach to historians is the thesis. Again, why are there 100, 200, 300 books on Abraham Lincoln? Because each of those books has a different argument. They have a different thesis. So this is really the most important part of your introduction. It shows that you know what you're talking about and that, again, you're making a unique contribution. So let's talk a little bit about this. So a thesis, first of all, in terms of its position in the introduction, regardless of how many paragraphs you have, will be placed at the end of an introduction. Now, another thing, just like the introduction itself, which can be several paragraphs long, the thesis does not have to be a single sentence. It can be a couple, however long it takes for you to make your point, to make your argument. But I want to be clear about this again. This is going to be your argument. It's going to be unique. It's going to be your own original idea. So therefore, it is not descriptive. To give you an example, like the one I have below here on the screen, this essay is about how the United States fought its longest war in the deserts and mountains of Afghanistan in the early 21st century. That's too descriptive. That's telling me what happened. To be blunt, I don't care about what happened. That's basic knowledge. What are you going to argue about the U.S. presence in Afghanistan in the early 21st century? That's what you need to show me in this thesis. Secondly, it's not a question. So again, to look at the second example here, why did the United States fight its longest war in Afghanistan in the early 21st century? That would be a question that you could answer, but your thesis needs to be the answer. Your thesis needs to explain why the United States fought its longest war in Afghanistan in the early 21st century. Finally, your thesis is not a fact. It is not a fact. To go to the third example, the United States fought in Afghanistan in the early 21st century. That's common knowledge. Anybody off the street can really basically say that. Again, you as a historian writing this paper, you're going to make a unique argument about the United States fighting this war in Afghanistan because you have sort of insider knowledge. You've looked at the primary sources. You looked at the documents. So you know something unique about this war, and you are now going to make an argument. And when you're doing this, make sure that you avoid your thesis from being too expansive. Be specific. Don't bite off more than you can chew. So for instance, an example of a bad, too expansive thesis would be the United States became a global policeman in the 20th century. Now that's true, although people disagree, and this gets why it would actually make a good thesis. But there is no way you could discuss this in a short paper, article, or really even a book, because you'd have to explain decades, if not centuries, of the entire century. Rather, bite off a smaller chunk. Talk about how the United States became a global policeman in Latin America in the 1920s, or how the United States became a global policeman in Europe in the 1940s. And even then, focus more on a particular aspect of that role as global policeman. So again, be very specific. Do not have a too expansive thesis. Additionally, take a clear stance on a topic and offers an argument. You can be very clear here. I will argue. You can make that declarative statement, I will argue in this. You don't have to, as you see in the example, in fact, on the right from my conference paper, I don't say that. Rather, what I do is I say, despite the religious foundation of the Pledge of Resistance, its sudden and dramatic growth imperiled its faith-based character. What in the eyes of its founders represented the POR's greatest strength, its religious identity, became a distraction as the issue divided secular and faith-based activists. Additionally, as the POR's leaders squabbled, grassroots activists struggled to understand their role in Wallace's mighty nonviolent army, especially as the impending invasion never happened, resulting in further bickering among the troops. So as you can see there, first of all, my thesis, as I've said, is more than one sentence. Secondly, it makes an argument. My argument in this thesis is very clear. It is the fact that the religious foundation of the Pledge of Resistance was important, but nonetheless, as the Pledge of Resistance grew in size, it had more supporters. This faith-based character came under fire, and it started to be diminished. And as a result of that, we see this lead to eventually sort of the diminution of the religious identity of Pledge of Resistance. Additionally, the second part of my thesis argues that by focusing so much, though, on this debate, this internal debate between the faith-based and secular character of the Pledge of Resistance, basically these grassroots activists struggled to understand their role, and they basically reduced their influence on policy because they were more concerned about this issue of whether Pledge of Resistance should be faith-based. So again, be very specific. And finally, the last point I want to make about your thesis, it is evidence-based. It is based on the primary sources that you looked at. Granted, we've only looked at a few in this semester, but that is what you're going to base your argument here on, not opinion. It has to be based on hard facts. Just like a scientist, just like a physicist, just like a mathematician, a historian is no different. Your thesis has to be based on the evidence that is available.